So guys, today we are going to learn about the passive transport in detail. Before talking about the passive transport, we need to understand first the nature of the cell membrane. If we know the structure and the nature of the cell membrane, it will be easy to understand the transportation across the cell membrane. So let's start with the cell membrane. As we know, cell membrane has many components like protein channel which helps to transport molecule by facilitated diffusion. The cell membrane consists of cholesterol which gives a rigidity to the cell. It consists of an integral protein which also helps in protein transport. There is also alpha helix protein which is integrated protein, surface protein, globular protein which is also an integrated protein. There is a peripheral protein. This all helps for the transportation. According to the fluid mosaic model which was proposed by Cinder and Nicholson, according to this theory, the quasi-fluid nature of lipid enables lateral movement of proteins within overall bilayer, due to which molecules can be transported with the help of protein as they can move laterally through layer and transport molecule. The bilayer is composed of phospholipid. It consists of an hydrophilic head and hydrophobic tail. The hydrophilic head is attracted to water while the hydrophobic tail is repelled by the water. As we can see here, there is an hydrophobic tail and hydrophilic head. The yellow color is the hydrophilic head, and we can see the tail like structure which is inside, which is an hydrophobic tail, due to which it is called as a bilayer. So the question is that why the cell requires transportation? As cell requires nutrients, they are to be taken in, and as the metabolic reaction take place in which the catabolic reaction produce a byproduct which can be toxic to cell and is to be removed out of the cell time to time. So whenever we talk about the membrane transport, it is either about intake or removal of toxic material outside the cell. But what is the role of protein in the transportation? So the molecules like a small non-polar molecules O2 or CO2 can pass right through the membrane, but other molecules like the polar molecules like the water, glucose or ion or amino acid requires help to get in or out of the cell, and this help is given by the proteins. Let us take the example from which we will know the function of protein in the transportation of molecule. As we know, water molecule is hydrophilic, and it cannot be transported or it cannot pass through the hydrophobic tail. It requires a protein transporter to enter the cell. To transport water molecule, there is a specific protein which only transport water molecule, namely as aquaporins. Here we can see the first image. Here is the outside where the water molecule is present, and the cell membrane consists of an aquaporin embedded in it, through which the water molecule is going to enter in the cell. There are also the channel protein which also does the same function. Transportation across the cell membrane can take place through the two types. First is it can take place by passive transport or by the active transport. The major difference between the passive transport and the active transport is that in passive transport there is a no expenditure of energy, while in active transport there is an expenditure of energy. But why there is a requirement of energy? If we talk about the movement of molecule from higher concentration to the lower concentration, then there is no expenditure of energy. But if we want to transport molecule from the lower to higher concentration, we already the concentration is more, than there will be expenditure of energy to do that. So the passive transport. So passive transport can take place by the three types, that is the simple diffusion, facilitated diffusion, and by osmosis. So we will discuss the passive transport in detail. What is a passive transport and how does it take place? Passive transport is a transport in which molecules diffuse from higher concentration to the lower concentration across the cell membrane without expenditure of metabolic energy. The molecule move from higher to the lower concentration. It can take place by three types. First is passive transport through the simple diffusion, in which there is no need of integral protein to transport the molecule. Secondly is the passive transport through facilitated diffusion, in which specific integral protein is required to facilitate the movement of molecules like glucose, other sugars, amino acid across the cell membrane. The transport protein, for example, erythrocyte glucose transporter, is a specific for a particular molecule which is influenced by temperature, pH, and inhibitor. So let us discuss the simple diffusion in detail. Simple diffusion involves the movement of particle down a concentration gradient in which protein is excluded. There is no involvement of protein in the simple diffusion. Molecules or ions present in a higher concentration on one side of a plasma membrane naturally travel diffuse across the membrane until a state of equilibrium is reached. That is, the concentration of molecule is same on the both sides. Only relatively small uncharged or hydrophobic molecules like H2O, O2, CO2, other gases, urea, and ethanol cross the lipid bilayer by simple diffusion. No membrane protein are involved, so there is no specificity. The molecule in aqueous solution on one side of the membrane dissolves into the lipid bilayer, crosses it, and then dissolves into the aqueous solution on the opposite side. So now we will discuss about the facilitated diffusion. Unlike the simple diffusion, the facilitated or the carrier mediated diffusion of a molecule across a biological membrane is dependent on a specific integral membrane protein, which is oftenly called as a unipods. Let us take the example of facilitated diffusion. The example is uptake of glucose into erythrocyte by the glucose transporter, the erythrocyte RBCs. The erythrocyte glucose transporter is an integral membrane protein which is asymmetrical orientated in the plasma membrane. As we can see here, the area outside the cell and the inside the cytosol, as we can see here, the plasma membrane which is embedded by the glucose transporter protein. This glucose transporter protein, which is uniporter protein structure, forms a central pore through which glucose molecule is passed upon conformational changes in the protein. That means when the glucose is bind, then the protein will go under the conformation changes, and this whole process is freely reversible. What happens actually? Okay, when the glucose binds to the glucose transporter, then the transporter undergoes conformational changes, and when the glucose diffuse into the cytosol, then the transporter returns to its original conformation as it was earlier. Why is facilitated diffusion important? Because facilitated diffusion allows the passage of substances that are restricted by their size, being unable to pass through membrane channels, or by being too lipid insoluble to pass through the phospholipid bilayer. This substance move down the concentration gradient by integral protein which act as a transporter, unipod protein. Technically, facilitated diffusion isn't a diffusion, as the carrier protein can become saturated with moving solute and the rate of solute movement. Let us discuss about the osmosis, which is the last point of our lecture. Osmosis is the movement of molecule of water across a semi-permeable membrane from a region of a lower concentration to the higher concentration, solute concentration, until the equilibrium is reached. So in today's lecture, we have discussed about the transportation across a cell membrane, in which we have discussed about the passive transport, simple, in which we have discussed simple diffusion, facilitated diffusion, and osmosis.